So Terry Prachett was a beloved fantasy author, probably best known for his Discworld series. I'm going to talk through some of his quotes and tips for writers, and at the end I'll share a great piece of his writing as well. Here's his first piece of advice. There can be no better grounding for a lifetime as an author than to see humanity in all its various guises. This is fundamental writing advice, I think. People are everything when it comes to storytelling. I often focus on creating real characters and deepening characterization. If you've been to my channel before, you will have heard me say stories are all about people. But what I think we can sometimes overlook as writers, as we try to bring our vision of our story to life, is that we're actually writing it for someone else. I think it's important not to forget about that element of humanity, or that part of how people are linked to storytelling. And I don't mean we're writing for someone else, so make sure there's no typos, make sure your sentences are clear, make sure your story's easy to understand. All of that's important, but it's not what I mean. What I mean is, stories to me are about sharing some part of the human condition, or bringing to light some experience of the writer that readers might have experienced too. That's how some of my favourite books have become my favourite books, because they speak to me as a person as well. I read them and think, yeah, me too. Humanity has various guises, as his quote says, so by all means, create them in your characters, but don't forget you're writing your story for them too. I read anything that's going to be interesting, but you don't know what it is until you've read it. Somewhere in a book on the history of false teeth, there'll be the making of a novel. More great advice, I think. Sometimes the practice of writing regularly kind of elbows reading out of the way for me. Writing absolutely influences what books I'll pick up and read. Sometimes I'll pick up a book and think, yeah, I could read it, but I'm not sure I'm going to get a whole lot out of it when it comes to my own writing. So then I'll prioritise a different book and get nothing out of that. I'm almost never correct. The issue with reading so selectively like that is that you'll absolutely miss things that could spark ideas. I call them micro-ideas myself. And Terry Pratchett's absolutely right. Even in the most unlikely of texts, you might find a second of something, or a little spark. I'm not saying that reading a leaflet in the dentist's office is going to bring an entire novel to you, but it might just bring a little insight into how a character behaves, or highlight a weird little scenario in life. Those micro ideas I often find are like the tip of an iceberg. Once you start getting them down on paper, you discover there's actually loads more to it underneath the waterline. It's happened to me many times, probably so many times that now I don't remember what that initial spark was, because it's part of a massive project that I ended up finishing. It's worth reading anything you find interesting, as he says. Don't make the same mistake I do of trying to assess the value of reading something before you read it. It doesn't work. Writing a novel is as if you're going off on a journey across a valley. The valley's full of mist, but you can see the top of a tree here and the top of another tree over there. And with any luck, you can see the other side of the valley, but you cannot see down into the mist. Nevertheless, you head for the first tree. This is quite a famous piece of writing craft imagery from Terry Prachett. Kind of like the micro ideas we were just talking about, he's absolutely right in that the mist can contain all kinds of storytelling gold. I think he put it really beautifully there. This is a kind of reassuring quote in many ways. I think at first every writer sees their story, if not as a misty valley, then as some other kind of incomprehensible expanse in front of them. And this quote personally reminds me to check myself on one of my biggest failings as a writer, and to some extent as a person. I often find I want to know all of the information. I need to know absolutely everything there is to know beforehand so I can be ready. So obviously my inclination is to learn every detail of my story before I write it. But when I come to actually plan it that way, for some reason that approach has just never worked for me. So I often find myself standing in the misty valley beneath the only tree that I can see, the safety tree, and I'll think that I need to know exactly where the next tree is, how far away it is, how tall it is, what it looks like, before I can make a move, but really I don't. When I leave the safe tree and I step into the mist, that's often where I find I do some of the writing that I'm most proud of. And I always end up finding the next tree just fine anyway. Got a little bit philosophical there, but the point still stands. You don't need to know absolutely everything about your story in order to write it. You've just got to spend time in the mist, and that's sometimes where the magic is. If necessary, I'll write the ending fairly early on in the process. Now that ending may not turn out to be the real ending by the time that I've finished, but I'll write down now what I think the conclusion of the book's going to be. This is an interesting approach and not something I've ever tried before. I tend to know what the ending of my story is going to be before I write the story, but I leave it till the end to write it. But I can definitely see the merit in writing it first. I could see how that would be helpful. To me, it's all about structure, and I don't mean 3-act structure or story beats, templates, anything like that. I mean actual structure. It feels like the ending he's talking about here that he writes ahead of time almost acts like scaffolding, or a frame that holds the story together as he builds it. Not to mention, if you're happy to write an ending knowing that it may entirely change by the time you get there, it could be great practice for settling into the story you're telling and settling into the voice of your narrator before you actually start in earnest. You can wear off the rust a bit with something that might not matter if you're going to rewrite it anyway. And this is novel writing we're talking about, so you're always going to end up rewriting it at least once. That's good advice, I would think, especially if you're struggling to get going with your story, so maybe give it a try. I also found a couple of general quotes from Terry Prachett that, though they don't directly concern writing, I think they can still absolutely apply. Here's the first one. It's not worth doing something unless someone, somewhere, would much rather you weren't doing it. As a person who makes creative writing content on YouTube, I am acutely aware of the people that would rather I weren't doing it. When my channel was smaller even than it is now, I didn't used to get these comments, but now that I do, I kind of look at them in the same spirit as this quote. And it happens with my writing too. I've had my writing described as cinematic by a prize that I was shortlisted for, and it was absolutely meant as a compliment and taken as one. But then I've also had people use the exact same word, cinematic, and meant it as an insult. Whatever the case, I think the way I look at it is the same way that Terry Prachett looked at it. If we're making readers feel something about what we're writing, then we can't be doing too much wrong. The presence of those seeking the truth is infinitely to be preferred to the presence of those who think they've found it. I picked this quote out because it's a great reminder of why I write personally. I'm not writing because I think I'm brilliant and the world needs to know what I think. I'm not writing because I find the whole thing easy and I want the world to know how easy it is for me. Neither of those is true. I'm also not writing because I've figured a bunch of stuff out about how the world works or how people do. Like I was saying before, you don't need to know everything when you're writing. You don't need to have all of the answers. I often hear that your book needs to make a point. You need to write with meaning. It has to be about something. And I think that is true. But the way that I used to look at it was that I needed to make a huge contribution to the literary canon of human experience. But now I've realised that making a point with your writing, or writing with meaning, can simply mean wondering aloud what any of this is for. I want to finish with a quick piece of Terry Pratchett's writing, and I'm sure there's hundreds if not thousands of passages I could have picked out, and if you know any, by all means leave them in the comments for me, but the one I picked was from his novel Night Watch. In fact, it was the opening lines. Sam Vimes sighed when he heard the scream, but he finished shaving before he did anything about it. As far as a story opening goes, it's got plot, it's got characters, it's interesting, and above all else, it makes you want to read on. There's not a whole lot else you could ask for with your opening lines, I don't think. I hope this video was useful. Thank you so much for watching, and as always, happy writing.